Hello everyone, you're watching Let's Talk About Prepping. I'm Tyler, your host, and in this video we're going to continue our reading of the book Lucifer's Hamner by Larry Niven and Jerry Parnell. This is a really good book about an asteroid hitting Earth and some of the after effects that are dealt with by the survivors. It is indeed a little slow starting, but it's a good book, so hopefully you'll read along or catch up. Strongly suggest getting a copy for yourself. Anyways, today we'll continue with March 1. And the Lord hung a rainbow as a sign. Won't be water, but fire next time. Traditional spiritual. Mark Chesky looked up at the house and whistled. It was California Tudor, off-white stucco with massive wood beams inset at angles. They'd be real wood. Some places, like Glendale, had the same style of house with plywood strips to fake it, but not Bel Air. The house was large on a large lot. Mark rang the front doorbell. Presently, it was opened by a young man with long hair and pencil-thin mustache. He looked at Mark's Rough Rider trousers and boots and at the large brown cases Mark had set on the porch. "We don't need any," he said. "I'm not selling any. I'm Mark Chesky from NBS. "Oh, sorry. You'd be surprised how many peddlers we get. Come on in. My name's George. I'm the houseboy." He lifted one of the cases. "Heavy." "Yeah." Mark was busy looking around. Paintings, a telescope, globes of Earth, Mars, and the Moon, glass statuary, Steuben crystal, trip toys. The front room had been set up as for a theater party, couches facing the TV. "Must have been a bitch moving that stuff," Mark said. "Sure was. Here, put that in here. Anything tricky about it?" "Not if you know video recorders." "I ought to," George said. "I'm a drama student. UCLA. But we haven't had that course yet. You better show me." "Will you be running it tonight?" "Nah, I've got a rehearsal. Wild Duck. Good part. Mr. Hamner will do it. Then I'll show him." "You'll have to wait then. He's not home yet. Want a beer?" "That'd go nice." Mark followed George to the kitchen. A big room, gleaming chrome and formica everywhere. 2 double sinks, 2 gas ovens, 2 ranges. A large counter held trays of canapes covered with saran wrap. There was a desk and bookshelves which held cookbooks, the latest Travis McGee thrillers, and Stanislavski's An Actor Prepares. Only the thrillers and Stanislavski showed any signs of use. I'd have thought Hamner would find himself an astronomy student. "Last guy here was," George said. He got out beer. "They fought a lot." "So Hamner fired him?" "No, he sent him up to his place in the mountains. Hamner likes to fight, but not when he's at home. He's easy to work for. And there's color TV in my room, and I get to use the pool and sauna." "Hard to take." Mark sipped at the beer. "This must be one swingin' party pad." George laughed. "Like hell. The only parties are when I bring in a show cast. Or like tonight. Relatives." Mark eyed George carefully. Pencil mustache, actor's fine features. What the hell, he thought. Hamner gay or something? "Christ, no," George said. "No, he just doesn't go out much. I fixed him up with the second lead in our last show. Nice girl from Seattle. Hamner took her out a couple of times, then nothing. Irene said he was polite and a perfect gentleman until they were alone, then he leaped at her. She should have leaped back." "That's what I said, but she didn't." George cocked his head to one side. "That's Mr. Hamner coming now. I recognize the engine." Tim Hamner went to the side door and into the small suite that he thought of as his home. It was the part of the house he felt most comfortable in, although he used the whole place. Hamner didn't like his house. It had been chosen by the family money managers for resale value, and it had that. It gave him plenty of space to display the things he'd collected, but it didn't seem like a home. He poured himself a short scotch and sank into an Ames chair. He put his feet up on the matching footstool. It felt good. He'd done his duty. He'd gone to a director's meeting and listened to all the reports and congratulated the company president on the quarterly earnings. Tim's natural inclination was to let those who liked playing with money do it, but he'd had a cousin who lost everything that way. It never hurt to let money managers know you were looking over their shoulders. Thinking of the meeting reminded him of the secretary at the office. She'd chatted pleasantly with Tim before the meeting, but she'd pleaded a date when he asked her for dinner for tomorrow. Maybe she did have a date. She was polite enough, but she'd turned him down. Maybe, he thought, maybe I should have asked her for next Friday, or next week. But then if she said no, there'd be no doubt about why. He heard George talking with someone out in the living room, and wondered idly who it might be. George wouldn't disturb him until he came out. That was one nice thing about his house. He could have his suite to himself. But then Tim remembered. That would be the man from NBS, with the cut scenes, the ones Tim had liked but hadn't got into the documentary. He got up in enthusiasm and began changing clothes. Penelope Wilson arrived about 6. She had never answered to Penny. Her mother had insisted. Tim Hamner, looking at her through the spy eye in the door, suddenly remembered that she had given up Penelope too. She'd taken to using her middle name, and Tim couldn't remember it. Be brave. He threw the door wide and, letting his agony show, cried, "Quick! What's your middle name?" "Joyce." "Hello, Tim. Am I the first?" "Yes. You look elegant." He took her coat. He had known her forever, since grade school anyway. Penelope Joyce had gone to the same girls' prep school as Tim's sister and half a dozen girl cousins. She had been the homely one, with her wide mouth and too square jaw, and a figure best described as sturdy. In college, she had begun to bloom. She was indeed elegant tonight. Her hair was long and wavy and complexly arranged. Her dress was clean of line and of a color and texture soft to the eye. Tim wanted to touch it. He'd lived with his sister long enough to know how long it must have taken to get that effect, even if he had no hint as to how it was done. Wanting her approval was automatic. He waited as she inspected his living room, wondering to himself why he'd never invited her before. Finally, she looked up with an expression Tim hadn't seen her use since high school, when she'd decided she was judge of all morals. "Nice room," she said approvingly. Then she giggled, ruining the pose. "Glad you like it. Damned glad, in fact." "Really? Is my opinion so important?" She was still teasing him with facial expressions from their childhood. "Yes, in a few minutes the whole damned family is going to be here, and most of them haven't seen this place. You think like they do, so if you like it, they will." I guess I deserved that." "Hey, I didn't mean—" She was laughing at him again. He got her a drink, and they sat. "I've been wondering," she mused. "We haven't seen each other for 2 years at least. Why did you ask me here tonight?" Tim was partly prepared for that. She had always been direct. He decided to be truthful. "I was thinking about who I wanted here tonight. A big ego thing, right? The show about my Comet. And I thought of Gil Waters, the top of my class at Kate, and my family, and you. Then I realized I was thinking of all the people I wanted to impress most. Me." "Right. We used to talk, remember? And I never could tell you what I wanted to do with my life. The rest of my family, everyone we grew up with, they make money, or collect art, or race cars, or do something. Me, I only wanted to watch the sky." She smiled. "I'm really flattered, Tim." "You really do look elegant. Your own creation?" "Yes, thank you." She was still easy to talk to. Tim was finding that a pleasant rediscovery when the doorbell rang. The others had come. It was a pleasant evening. The caterers had done their job well, so there was no trouble with the food, even without George to help. Tim relaxed and found he was having fun. They listened. They never had before. They listened as Tim told them how it had been. The cold, dark hours of watching, of studying star patterns, of keeping the log, of endless hours poring over photographs, all with no result except the joy of knowing the universe. And they listened. Even Greg, who usually made no secret of how he felt about rich men who didn't pay proper attention to their money. It was only a family gathering in Tim's living room, but he was elated and nervous and quiveringly alert. He saw Barry's smile and head shake and read Barry's mind from that. What a way to spend a life. He's actually envying me, Tim thought, and it was delicious. Tim glanced up to catch his sister, watching with wry amusement. Jill had always been able to tell what Tim was thinking. He'd been closer to her than either had been to their brother Pat. But it was Pat who trapped him behind the bar and wanted to talk. Like your place, Pat said. Mom doesn't know what to make of it. He tilted his head to indicate where their mother was wandering around the room, looking at gadgets. At the moment, she was fascinated by the kaleidoscopes, random and strange patterns. But I know what she's thinking. Do you? Do I what? Bring girls here. Have wild parties. None of your goddamn business. Pat shrugged. Too bad. Man, there are times when I wish I'd... To hell with it. But you really ought to take advantage. You won't have forever. Mom will have her way. Sure, Tim said. Why the hell did Pat have to bring that up? His mother would, before the night was over. Timmy, why aren't you married yet? One day I'll answer, Tim told himself. One day I'll say it. Because every time I find a girl I think I could live with, you scare her spitless and she runs away, that's why. I'm still hungry, Penelope Joyce announced. Good Lord, Jill patted her stomach. Where do you put it? I want your secret. Only don't tell me it's your clothes. Greg says we can't afford your creations. Penelope took Tim's hand. Come on, show me where the popcorn is. I'll shake. You get the bowls. But they'll find their own drinks. She led him to the kitchen. Let them talk about you while you're out here. They'll admire you even more. After all, you're the star tonight. Think so? He looked into her eyes. I can never tell when you're putting me on. There's luck. Where's the butter? The show was great. Tim knew that when he saw his family watching him on television. Randall had gone all over the world, showing amateur astronomers staring at the sky. Most comets are discovered by amateurs, Randall said. The public rarely appreciates how much these skywatchers aid the big observatories. Of course, some amateurs aren't amateur at all. The scene cut to Tim Hamner showing off his mountain observatory, and his assistant, Marty, demonstrating equipment. Tim had thought the sequence would be too short, but when he watched his family watching him, and it ended with them eager for more, he realized that Harv Randall had been right. Always leave them wanting a little more. And, Randall's voice said, some are more amateur than others. The camera zoomed in on a smiling teenage boy with a telescope. The instrument looked competent, but it was obviously home-built. Gavin Brown of Centerville, Iowa. Gavin, how did you happen to be looking for comets at the right time and place? I wasn't. Brown's voice was not pleasant. He was young and shy, and he talked too loud. I made some adjustments to the setting circles because I wanted to look at Mercury in the daytime. Only you have to have everything adjusted right to find Mercury because it's so close to the sun, and... So you found Hamner Brown by accident, Harvey Randall said. Greg McCleve laughed. Jill gave her husband a sharp look. Tell me, Gavin, Randall said. Since you didn't see the comet until well after Mr. Hamner did, but you reported it almost the same instant, how did you know it was a new comet? It was something that didn't belong there. You mean you know everything that does belong there? Randall said. The screen showed a photograph of the sky around Hamner Brown. It was full of stars. Sure, doesn't everybody? He does, too, Tim said. He stayed here a week, and I swear he can draw star maps from memory. He stayed here? Tim's mother asked. Sure, in the spare room. Oh. Tim's mother stayed very hard at the set. Where's George tonight? Jill asked. Another date? Mother, did you know that Tim's houseboy has been dating Linda Gilray? Pass the popcorn, Penelope Joyce said. Where is Brown now, Tim? Back in Iowa. Those commercials sell much soap? Greg asked. He pointed at the set. Calva does all right, Tim said. 26.4% of the market last year. Geez, they must be better than I thought, Greg said. Who's your advertising man? Then the program was on again. There wasn't much more about Tim Hamner. Once discovered, Hamner-Brown Comet was the world's. Now the star was Charles Sharps, who talked about comets and the importance of knowing the sun and planets and stars. Tim wasn't disappointed, but he thought the others were, except for Pat, who watched Sharps and kept nodding. Once, Pat looked up and said, "If I'd had a science professor like him in my freshman year, I might have discovered a comet myself. Do you know him very well?" "Sharps? Never met him, but I've got more of him on the video recordings," Tim said. "There's more of me, too." Greg pointedly glanced at his watch. "Gotta be in the office at 5 a.m., he said. "The market's going crazy. And after that show, it will be worse." "Huh?" Tim frowned. "Why?" "Comets," Greg said. "Signs in the sky. Portents of evil change. You'd be surprised how many investors take things like that seriously. Not to mention that diagram the professor drew, the one that showed the comet hitting Earth." "But it didn't," Pat protested. "Tim, could it?" his mother demanded. "Of course not. Didn't you listen? Sharp said it was billions to one," Tim said. "I saw it," Greg said. "And he said comets did hit the Earth sometimes. And this one will be close." "But he didn't mean it that way," Tim protested. Greg shrugged. "I know the market. I'm going to be in the office when the big board opens." The phone rang. Tim looked puzzled. Before he could get up, Jill answered it. She listened for a moment, then looked puzzled as well. "It's your answering service. They want to know whether they should put through a call from New York." "Eh?" Tim got up to take the phone. He listened. On the TV, a NASA official was explaining how they might, just might, be able to get up a probe to study the comet. Tim put the phone down. "You look dazed," Penelope Joyce said. "I am dazed. That was one of the producers. They want me to be a guest on The Tonight Show. With Dr. Sharps, Pat, so I'll meet him after all." "I watch Johnny every night," Tim's mother said. She said it admiringly. People who got on The Tonight Show were important. Randall's documentary ended in a blaze of glory, with photographs of the sun and stars taken by Skylab, and a strong plea for a manned probe to explore Hamner-Brown Comet. Then came the last commercial, and Tim's audience was leaving. Tim realized, not for the first time, just how far apart they'd grown. He really didn't have much to say to the head of a stockbroker firm, or to a man who built townhouses, even if they were his brother-in-law and his brother. He found himself mixing drinks for himself and Penelope, Joyce, alone. It felt like opening night of a bad play, Tim said. "In Boston, with an allegory, and the Shriners are in town," Joyce teased. He laughed. "Ha! Haven't seen Light Up the Sky since... by golly, since you were in that summer drama thing. And you're right, that's what it was like." "Pooh." "Pooh?" "Pooh. You always did think like that, and there never was any reason to, and there isn't one now. You can be proud, Tim. What's next? Another comet?" "No, I don't think so." He squeezed lime into her gin and tonic and handed it to her. "I don't know. I'm not strong enough on theory to do what I really want." "So learn the theory." "Maybe." He came around and sat next to her. "But anyway, I made the history books. Skål." She lifted her drink in salute. She wasn't mocking him. "Skål." He sipped at his drink. "I'll follow it as far as it goes, whatever else I do. Randall wants another documentary, and we'll do it if the ratings aren't too bad." "Ratings? You worry about ratings?" "You're teasing me again." "Not this time." All right. I'll back another documentary, because I want it. We'll go heavy on the space probe. With enough publicity, we might get the probe up, and somebody like Sharps really will understand comets." "Thanks." She put a hand on his arm. "You're welcome. Run with it, Tim. Nobody else here tonight has done half of what they want to do. You've already got 3/4 and a shot at the rest." He looked at her and thought, if I married her, Mom would heave a great sigh of relief. She was in that limited class of women. They all seemed to know his sister Jill. They'd gone east to college and to New York during vacations. They'd broken the same rules. They were not afraid of their mothers. They were beautiful and frightening. The sex urge in a teenage boy was too powerful, too easily twisted and repressed. It made the beauty of a young woman into a flame, and when that flame was coupled to total self-confidence, a girl like any of Jill's friends could be a fearsome thing to a boy who had never believed in himself. Joyce wasn't fearsome. She wasn't pretty enough. She frowned. "What are you thinking?" God, no, he couldn't answer that one. I was remembering a lot. Had he been deliberately left alone with Joyce? Certainly she had stayed after the others had left. If he made a pass now... But he didn't have the courage. Or, he told himself, the kindness. She was elegant, yes, but you don't go to bed with a Steuben crystal vase. He got up and went to the video recorder. Want to watch some of the other clips? For a moment she hesitated. She looked at him carefully, then just as carefully drained her glass and set it on the coffee table. Thanks, Tim, but I'd better get some sleep. There's a buyer coming in tomorrow. She was still smiling when she left. Tim thought it a bit forced. Or, he wondered, am I just flattering myself? The maelstrom was intolerably crowded. Masses of all sizes whirled past each other, warping space into a complex topology that changed endlessly. The inner moons and planets were all scar tissue, worn craters beneath the atmospheres of Earth and Venus, naked ring walls and frozen lakes of magma spread across the faces of Mars, Mercury, Earth's moon. Here was even the chance of escape. The gravity fields around Saturn and Jupiter could fling a comet back out into the cold and the dark. But Saturn and Jupiter were wrongly placed, and the comet continued to fall, accelerating, boiling. Pockets of volatile chemicals burst and spurted away in puffs of dust and ice crystals. Now the comet moved in a cloud of glowing fog that might have shielded it from the heat, but didn't. Instead, the fog caught the sunlight across thousands of cubic miles and reflected it back to the comet head from every direction. Heat at the surface of the nucleus seeped inward. More pockets of gas ruptured and fired like attitude jets on a spacecraft, tossing the comet head this way and that. Masses tugged at it as it passed, lost and blind and falling. The dying comet dropped past Mars, invisible within a cloud of dust and ice crystals the size of Mars itself. A telescope on Earth found it as a blurred point near Neptune. March. Interludes. None of the astronauts ever walked on solid lunar rock, because everywhere they have gone, there was soil underfoot. This powdery layer is present because the moon has been bombarded by meteorites throughout geologic time. The unceasing barrage has so pulverized the surface that it has created a residual layer of rocky debris several meters thick. Dr. John A. Wood, Smithsonian Institute. Fred Lorene made delicate adjustments to his telescope. It was a big instrument, a 4-inch refractor on a heavy tripod. The apartment cost him too much money, but he had to have it for the location. His only furniture was a cheap couch, a few cushions on the floor, and the big telescope. Fred watched a darkened window a quarter-mile away. She had to come home soon. She always did. What could she be doing? She'd left alone. No one had come for her. The thought frightened him, then made him sick. Suppose she had met a man somewhere. Had they gone for dinner and then to his apartment? Even now he might be putting his filthy hands on her breasts. He would have hairy hands, rough like a mechanic's, and they would be sliding downward, caressingly down across the flat curve of her belly. No, she wasn't that kind. She wouldn't let anyone do that to her. She wouldn't. But all women did, even his mother. Fred Lorene shuddered. Unwanted, the memory came back when he was just 9, when he'd gone in to ask his mother to say his prayers, and she'd been lying on the bed with the man he called Uncle Jack on top of her. She was moaning and writhing, and Uncle Jack had leaped from the bed. "You little bastard, I'll cut your goddamn balls off. You want to watch? You'll sure to God watch. Stand there, and if you say one word, I'll cut your prick off." He'd watched, and his mother had let that man. The window came alight. She was home. Fred held his breath. Was she alone? Was she? She was carrying a big bag of groceries, which she took to the kitchen. Now she'll have her drink, Fred thought. I wish she wouldn't drink so much. She looks tired. He watched as the girl mixed a martini. She carried the pitcher with her to the kitchen. Fred didn't follow with the telescope, although he could have. Instead, he teased himself, waiting. Her face was triangular, with high cheekbones and a small mouth and big dark eyes. Her long flowing blonde hair was tinted. Her pubic hair was very dark. Fred had forgiven her that small deception, but he'd been shocked. She came back with the pitcher and a glass spoon. There was a silver-handled martini spoon in the gift shop down the street, and Fred had often stared at it, trying to get up the nerve to buy it for her. Maybe she'd invite him to her apartment. Only, she wouldn't until he'd given her gifts, and he couldn't do that because he knew what she liked, and she'd want to know how he knew that. Fred Lorene reached out to touch her through the magic mirror of his telescope, but only in his mind, only in his hopeless yearning. Now she'd do it. She didn't have many dresses good enough to wear to work. She worked in the bank, and although the banks let the girls wear trousers and all the ugly things girls were wearing lately, she didn't. Not Colleen. He knew her name. He wanted to keep his money in her bank, but he didn't dare. She dressed well to win promotions, and she'd been promoted to new accounts, and Fred couldn't talk to her there. He was proud of her promotion, but he wished she'd stay to tell her, because then he could come in and go to her window, and... She took off the blue frock and carefully hung it in the only closet. Her apartment was very small, only one room with a bathroom and kitchen alcove. She slept on the couch. Her slip was frayed. He'd watched her mending the straps at night. Under the slip, she wore lacy black underpants. He could see the color through the slip. Sometimes she wore pink ones with black stripes. Soon, she'd be taking her bath. Colleen took long baths. Fred could be knocking at her door before she finished. She'd open the door. She trusted people. Once, she'd opened the door wearing nothing but a towel, and the man outside had been a telephone man. And another time, it was the building superintendent, and Fred knew he could imitate the super's voice. He'd followed the super to a bar and listened to him. She would open the door, but he couldn't do it. He knew what he'd do if she opened her door to him. He knew what would happen afterward. This would be his third time. Third sex offense. They'd lock him up with those men, those animals. Fred remembered what the caged men had called him and how they had used him. He whimpered, throttling the sound as if she might hear. She put on her robe. Her dinner was in the oven, and she sat in the robe and turned on the TV set. Fred scurried across the room to turn on his own set and tune it to the same channel, then moved quickly back to the telescope. Now he could watch over her shoulder, watch her own TV, and hear the sound, and it was as if Fred and his girl were watching TV together. It was a program about a comet. The stocky man's hands were large and smooth, slender, stronger than they looked. They moved over Maureen, knowingly, cunningly. "Purr," said Maureen. She pulled him suddenly against her and arched sideways, wrapping him in her long legs. He gently pushed her away and continued to stroke her, playing her like the attitude jets on a lunar lander. The bizarre image stuck in her mind, jarring. His lips moved against her breast, his tongue darting. Then it was time, and she could lose herself in him. She had no thought of technique now, but he had. He was always in control. He wouldn't be finished until she was, and she could depend on it. And now there was no time for thought, only the waves of shuddering feeling. She came home from a long way away. They lay together, breathing each other's breath. Finally he stirred against her. She caught a handful of curly hair and tilted his face up. Standing, he was just her height. Astronauts are generally short. Lying above her, his head reached her throat. She lifted herself to kiss him and sighed contentment. But now her mind was turned on again. I wish I loved him, she said to herself. Why don't I? Because he's too invulnerable? Johnny, does your mind ever turn off? He thought it through before answering. There's a story they tell about John Glenn. He rolled onto an elbow. The space medicine boys were trying to find out what he could go through and still function. They had John Glenn wired with widgets so they could watch his heartbeat and perspiration while he went through a program on the Gemini flight simulator. Right in the middle of it, they dropped a shitload of scrap iron onto a tilted iron plate right behind him. The whole room rang with it, and it went on and on. Glenn's heartbeat went blip. Johnny's fingers sketched a teepee shape. He never even twitched. He went through the whole sequence, and then he said, "You sons of bitches." He watched her laugh, and then he said a bit sadly, "We can't get distracted." He sat up. "If we're going to watch your program, we ought to be getting up." "Yeah, I suppose. You first." "Right." He bent to kiss her again, then left the bed. She heard the shower running and thought of joining him, but he wouldn't be interested now. She'd said the wrong thing, and now he'd be remembering his ruined career. Ruined not by any mistake of his, but by America's retreat from space. She found his robe where he'd left it for her. Forethought. We can't get distracted. One thing at a time, and do that perfectly. Whether it was crawling along a ruined Skylab and repairing it in orbit, or conducting a love affair, he did it right, and he was never in a hurry. When they met, Baker had been in the astronaut office in Houston and was assigned as liaison to Senator Jellison and party. Johnny Baker had a wife and 2 teenage kids, and had been a perfect gentleman, taking Maureen to dinner when the senator was called away, keeping her company for the week the senator was in Washington, taking her to the launch in Florida. A perfect gentleman up to the time they'd had to go back to her motel room for her purse, and she still wasn't sure who had seduced whom. She didn't sleep with married men. She didn't like sleeping with men she didn't love, for that matter. But, love aside, he had something, and Lorene had no defense against it. He had a single goal and the ability to go after it, no matter what. And she was young and had been married once, and had taken no vow of chastity, and the hell with what you're thinking, girl. Maureen rolled off the bed fast and switched on the TV with a vicious click, just to break the chain of thought. But I am not a tramp. His divorce is final next week, and I had nothing to do with that. Anne never knew. Anne doesn't know now. But maybe he wouldn't have let her go? If that's my fault, all right, but Anne never knew. We're still good friends. He's not the same anymore, Anne had told her. Not since he flew the mission. Before that, it was always tough here. He was on training missions all the time, and I had only a little part of him, but I had something. And then he got his chance, and everything worked fine, and my husband's a hero, and I don't have a husband anymore. Anne couldn't understand it. I can, Maureen thought. It wasn't flying the mission, it was that there aren't any more missions, and if you're Johnny Baker, and all your life you've worked and trained to do one thing, and nobody's ever going to do that again? One goal in life. Tim Hamner had a touch of that. Johnny had it, and maybe she had tried to borrow a piece of it. And now look. Johnny had used up his one goal, and the most important thing in Maureen Jellison's life was a fight with a silly Washington hostess. It still bothered her every time she thought of it. Annabelle Cole was liberated. 6 months ago it had been the threatened extinction of the snail skimmer. In 6 months more it might be the decline of artistic tradition among Australian blackfellas. At the moment there was nothing for it but to blame men for everything bad that had ever happened. Nobody really minded. They didn't dare. No mean amount of the world's business was conducted at Annabelle's parties. Maureen must have been edgy the night Annabelle braced her for her father's support. Annabelle wanted Congress to fund studies on artificial wombs to free women from months of slavery to their suddenly altered bodies. And I told her, Maureen thought, I told her that having babies was part of the sex act, and if she was willing to give up being pregnant, she could give up fucking too. I said that, and I never had a baby in my life. Dad might miss some important contacts through his daughter's exercise and tact, but Maureen could handle that. In 6 months, when Annabelle found a new cause, Maureen would host a party and invite someone Annabelle had to meet. She had it all worked out. That was the problem, as if a fight with Annabelle Cole was the most important event in her life. I'll fix some drinks, Johnny called. Best get your shower, the program's on in a minute. Yo, she answered, and she thought, him? Marry the man. Promote him a new career. Get him to run for office or write his memoirs. He'd be good at anything he tried. But why couldn't she find goals of her own? The room was definitely a man's room, with books and models of the fighter planes Johnny Baker had flown, and a Skylab with broken wings, and a large framed picture of a bulky suited man crawling in space along one of those wings, a faceless alien shape disconnected from the spacecraft, risking the loneliest death ever if he let go for even an instant. The NASA medal hung below the picture. Mementos of time passed, but only the past. There were no pictures of the shuttle, delayed once more, no reminders of the Pentagon, Johnny's present assignment. 2 pictures of the children, one with Anne in the background. Short, brown, competent Anne, who already had a look of puzzled unhappiness in the photo. His hand was wrapped around the glass, but he had forgotten glass and hand. Maureen could watch his face without his knowing it. Johnny Baker saw only the screen. Parabolic orbits diagrammed against the concentric circular paths of the planets. Old photos of Halley's Comet and Brooks's Comet and Cunningham's Comet and others, culminating in a blurred pinpoint that was Hamner Brown. A man with large insectile glasses lectured with fierce intensity. Oh, we'll get hit someday. It probably won't be an asteroid either. The orbits are too nearly fixed. There must have been asteroids whose orbits intersected Earth's, but those have had 4 billion years to hit us, and most of them eventually did, said the lecturer. They hit so long ago that even the craters are gone, weathered away, except for the biggest and the newest. But look at the moon. The comets are different. The lecturer's pointer traced a parabola drawn in chalk. Some mass way out there beyond Pluto, maybe an undiscovered planet. We even have a name for it, Persephone. Some mass disturbs the orbits of those great snowballs, and they come down on our heads in a wake of boiling chemicals. None of them have ever had a chance to hit the Earth until they get thrown down into the inner system. One day we'll be hit. We'd have about a year's warning, maybe more if we can learn enough about Hamner Brown. Then an antiseptic young woman proclaimed that she wasn't married to her house, and was told that that was why Calva Soap had invented a new disinfectant for her toilet bowl. And Johnny Baker came smiling back into the world. He really makes his points, doesn't he? It is well done. Did I tell you I met the man who put it together? I met Tim Hamner, too, at the same party with Harvey Randall. Hamner's a case. Manic. He'd just discovered his comet, and he couldn't wait to tell anyone. Johnny Baker sipped his drink. Then, after a long pause, he said, "Some funny rumors in the Pentagon." "Oh?" "Gus called. From Downey. Seems Rockwell's refurbishing an Apollo. And there's some mutters about diverting one of the Titan boosters from a big bird to something else. Know anything?" She sipped her drink and felt a wave of sadness. Now she knew why Johnny Baker had called yesterday. After 6 weeks in the Pentagon, 6 weeks in Washington with no attempt to see her, and I was going to surprise him. Some surprise. Tad's trying to get Congress to fund a Comet study mission, Lorene said. "This for real?" Johnny demanded. "It's for real." But his hands were shaking. His hands never shook. Johnny Baker had flown fighters over Hanoi, and his maneuvers were always perfect. The MiGs never had a chance. And once he'd taken splinters out of his crew chief when there wasn't time to get the medics. There was a splinter in the chief's chest, and Baker had removed it and sliced deftly to expose the artery, clamped it together with steady fingers while the chief screamed and the Kong mortars thudded onto the field, and his hands had never shaken. But they were shaking now. Congress won't put up the money. They might. The Russians are planning a mission. Can't let them outdo us, Lorene said. Peace depends on showing them we're still willing to compete if that's the way they want it. And if we compete, we win. I don't care if it's Martians we're competing with. I've got to go. I've got to. He drained a scotch. His hands were suddenly steady. Marine watched in fascination. He'd stopped shaking because he'd got a mission. And I know what it's like. To get him on that ship. A minute ago, he might really have been in love with me. Not now. I'm sorry, he said abruptly. We don't have all that much time together, and I'm laying this on you. But you had me dead to rights. My mind doesn't turn off. He drank deeply of his ice-diluted scotch. His attention went back to the screen and left Marine wondering if she'd been imagining things. Just how clever was Johnny Baker? The commercial mercifully ended and the camera zoomed in on the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. Harry Newcomb hastily chewed the last of his sandwich while he drove the mail truck with one hand. The regulations gave him time off for lunch, but Harry never took it. He used the time for better purposes. It was long past noon when he got to Silver Valley Ranch. As usual, he stopped at the gate. There was a spot where he could look through a pass in the foothills to the majesty of the High Sierra to the east. Snow gleamed off their tops. To the west were more foothills, the sun not too far above them. Finally he got out to open the gate, drove through, and carefully closed the gate behind him. He ignored the large mailbox on its post beside the gate. He stopped along the drive to pick a pomegranate from the grove that had started as one tree and was still, untended, propagating itself downhill toward the stream. Harry had seen it grow in the half-year he'd been on the route, and was guessing when the pomegranates would roll all the way downhill and into the cocklebur patch. Would they choke out the burrs? He had no idea, really. Harry was a city boy. Harry was an ex-city boy. Ha! And if he never saw a city again, he'd be happy. He was grinning as he shouldered his load and walked lopsided to the door. Rang, set the bag down. The dimly heard hurricane of a vacuum cleaner calmed. Mrs. Cox opened the door and smiled at the bulging bag beside Harry. That day again. Hello, Harry. Hi. Happy Trash Day, Mrs. Cox. And a happy trash day to you, too, Harry. Coffee? Don't stay me. It's against government regulations. Fresh coffee and new-baked rolls. Well, I can't resist that. He reached into the smaller pouch that still hung at his side. Letter from your sister in Idaho, and something from the senator. He handed her the letters, then shouldered the bag and wobbled in. Any place special? The dining table's big enough. Harry spilled the contents of the larger bag across a polished table of lovely grain. It seemed to have been carved out of a slice of a single tree, and must have been 50 years old. They didn't make tables like that anymore. If there was furniture like that in the caretaker's home, what must it be like in the big house up the hill? The wood grain was hidden under a deluge. Begging letters from charities, from several political parties, from colleges. Offers to join lotteries by buying records, clothing, books, subscriptions to magazines. You may already have won $100 a week for life. Religious tracts, political lessons, single-tax literature, free samples of soap, mouthwash, detergent, deodorant. Alice Cox brought in the coffee. She was only 11, but she was already beautiful. Long blonde hair, blue eyes, a trusting girl, as Harry knew from seeing her when he was off duty. But she could be trusting here. Nobody was going to bother her. Most of the men in Silver Valley kept rifles slung on racks in their pickups, and they damned well knew what to do with anybody who'd bothered an 11-year-old girl. It was one of the things Harry liked about the valley. Not the threat of violence, because Harry hated violence, but that it was only a threat. The rifles came off their racks only for deer, in season or out, if the ranchers were hungry or the deer got into the crops. Mrs. Cox brought in rolls. Half the people on Harry's route offered him coffee and eats, on days when he ignored regulations and brought the mail up to their houses. Mrs. Cox didn't make the best coffee on the route, but the cup was definitely the finest in the valley. Thin-boned china, much too good for a half-hippie mailman. The first time Harry had been to the house, he drank water from a tin cup and stood at the door. Now he sat at the fine table and drank coffee from boned china. Another reason to stay out of the cities. He sipped hurriedly. There was another blonde girl, this one over 18 and legal, and it would be trash day for her house, too. She'd be home. Donna Adams was always home for Harry. "Lot here for the senator," Harry said. "Yes, he's back in Washington," Mrs. Cox answered. "But he's coming soon," Alice piped. "Wish he'd hurry," Mrs. Cox said. "It's nice here when the senator's in residence. People coming and going, important people. The president stayed at the big house one night. Secret Service made a big fuss. Men wandering all over the ranch." She laughed, and Alice giggled. Harry looked puzzled. "As if anybody in this valley would harm the President of the United States," Mrs. Cox said. "I still think your Senator Jellison's a myth," Harry said. "I've been on this route 8 months, and I haven't seen him yet." Mrs. Cox looked him up and down. He seemed a nice enough boy, although Mrs. Adams said her daughter paid him entirely too much attention. Harry's long, flowing, curly brown hair would have looked good on a girl. His beard was beautiful. The real masterpiece was the mustache. It came to long points, which, on formal occasions, Harry could curl and wax into circles like small spectacles. He can grow hair, Mrs. Cox thought, but he's little and skinny, not as big as I am. She wondered again what Donna Adams saw in him. Car, maybe. Harry had a sports car, and all the local boys drove pickups like their fathers. "You'll likely meet the senator soon enough," Mrs. Cox said. It was a sign of ultimate approval, although Harry didn't know that. Mrs. Cox was very careful about who the senator met. Alice had been sifting through the mound of multicolored paper on the table. "Lots of it this time. How much is this?" 2 weeks, Harry said. "Well, we do thank you, Harry," Mrs. Cox said. "So do I," Alice added. "If you didn't bring it up to the house, I'd have to carry all of it." Back in the truck and down the long drive, with another stop to look at the high Sierra. Then on to the next ranch, a good half-mile away. The senator kept a big spread, although a lot of it was dry pasture, shot through with ground squirrel holes. It was good land, but there wasn't enough water to irrigate it. At the next gate, George Christopher was doing something incomprehensible in the orange groves. Probably setting up to smudge, Harry decided. Christopher came plodding up as Harry opened the gate. He was a bull of a man, Harry's height and 2 or 3 times Harry's width, with a thick neck. His head was bald and tanned, but Christopher couldn't be a lot over 30. He wore a checkered flannel shirt and dark trousers, muddy boots. Harry set the bag down and got out beside it. Christopher frowned. "Trash day again, Harry." He studied the long hair and extravagantly trimmed beard, and the frown deepened. Harry grinned in return. "Yep, happy trash day. Every 2 weeks like clockwork. I'll take it up to the house for you." "You don't have to." "I like to." There wasn't a Mrs. Christopher, but George had a sister about Alice Cox's age, and she liked to talk to Harry. A very bright little girl, pleasant to talk to and full of news about Harry's valley. "All right, mind the dog." "Sure will." Harry never worried about dogs. "Ever wonder what the advertising industry would give for your head?" Christopher asked. "I'll trade him question for question," Harry said. "Why does the government give them a lower rate so they can waste more of our time and your taxes?" Christopher's frown faded, and he almost smiled. "Have at 'em, Harry. Lost causes are the only ones worth fighting for. And the taxpayers' cause is about as lost as they come. I'll close the gate behind you." Day's end. Clock out time. Harry went into the sorting rooms behind the post office. There was a note pinned to his station. Harry, the wolf wants to see you. Gina, XXX. Gina, tall, black, erect of posture and large of bone, the only black in the valley as far as Harry knew, was at the counter. Harry winked at her, then knocked at the supervisor's door. When he entered, Mr. Wolf regarded him coldly. Harry. Happy trash day, Wolf said. Oops, but Harry smiled. Thank you, and a happy trash day to you, sir. Not funny, Harry. Why do you do it? Why do you separate out the commercial mail and reserve it for 1 day every 2 weeks? Harry shrugged. He could have explained. Sorting junk mail took so much of his time that he didn't have a chance to chat with his customers, so he'd started letting it pile up. It had begun that way, but it had become popular with his people. Everybody's happy with it, Harry said defensively. People can go through the stuff or just drop it in the fireplace. It is illegal to withhold a citizen's mail, Wolf said. If someone has complained, I'll take him off the list, Harry said. I like to keep my customers happy. Mrs. Adams, Wolf said. Oh, too bad. Without trash day, he wouldn't have an excuse to go up to the Adams house and talk to Donna. You will deliver the commercial mail according to regulations, Wolf was saying, as it comes in, not in batches. Trash day will cease. Yes, sir. Any other way I can be obliging? Shave your beard. Cut your hair. Harry shook his head. That part of the regulations he knew. Wolf sighed. Harry, you just don't have the right attitude to be a mailman. Eileen Susan Hancock's office was small and cramped, but it was an office. She had worked for years to get an office of her own, away from the area behind the counter. It proved that she was more than a secretary. She was poking at the buttons on her calculator, frowning, when a sudden thought made her burst into rippling laughter. A moment later, she realized that Joe Corrigan was standing in her doorway. Corrigan came into the office. He had unbuttoned the top button of his trousers again, and it showed. His wife wouldn't let him buy larger sizes. She hadn't given up hope that he would reduce. He put his thumbs into the waistband and regarded her quizzically. Eileen's laughter cut off. She went back to the calculator, and now she wasn't even smiling. Okay, Corrigan said. What's the punchline? Eileen looked up with wide eyes. What? Oh, no, I couldn't possibly tell you. If you drive me nuts, you think you can gain control of the company, right? Because it won't work. I've covered that. Corrigan liked to see her like this. Eileen was all or nothing, very serious and hard at work, or enjoying herself to the full. Okay, Corrigan sighed. I'll give away my secret for yours. I've had the decorators in. You see, Robin Justin signed up for the marina deal. Oh, that's good. Yep, means we'll need more help. As of the 1st, you're assistant general manager, if you want the job. Oh, I want it. Thank you. She smiled flickeringly, like a flashbulb, on and off almost before you saw it, and turned back to the desk calculator. I knew you would. That's why I had the decorators in. They're turning that room next to mine into a new office for you. I've told them to consult you after they do the preliminaries. Corrigan lowered his weight onto the corner of her desk. There, I was keeping it for a surprise. Now what's your secret? I've forgotten, Eileen said, and I do have to get these estimates done so you can take them to Bakersfield with you. Okay, Corrigan said. He went back to his office, defeated. If he knew, Eileen thought. She had an urge to giggle, but she held it back. She wasn't really trying to tease Corrigan. She had been thinking, well, I did it. And Robin was nice. Not the world's greatest lover, but he didn't pretend to be either. The way he suggested a rematch, lovers need practice, he'd said. The second time is always better than the first. They'd left it vague. Maybe, just maybe, she'd take him up on it sometime. But probably not. He'd also told her definitely that he was married. She'd only suspected it before. Never had there been any suggestion that business had anything to do with their private lives. But he'd signed up with Corrigan's plumbing supplies for a very large deal. and she felt funny about that and wondered if she'd have been as careless about finding out Robin's marital status if the deal hadn't been pending. But he'd signed up. So here she was, adding up numbers, pushing papers around, and suddenly she'd asked herself, what does this have to do with plumbing? I don't make pipe. I don't lay pipe. I don't ream it out or tell people where to put it. What I do is push paper around. It was an important job. Measure it by the chaos she could create with one random mistake or one malicious error. Thousands of tons of supplies might be sent to the ends of the earth by a slip of her pen. But what she did had no more to do with creation, with making the things that held a civilization together, than income tax, or being the fireman on a diesel train. Mr. Corrigan would probably spend the whole day wondering why she'd suddenly burst into sparkling laughter, and there was no way she could tell him. It had just come to her unexpected and irresistible. What she had done with Robin Justin on the night before last was the closest she had ever come to any activity actually connected with plumbing. The car wouldn't be reported stolen for hours. Alan Nassau was pretty sure of that. Sure enough that he would sit in it for another 10 minutes. Alan Nassau had been a great man. When he had made himself great again, he would have to hide what he was doing now. Before he was great, he had been George Washington Carver Davis. His mother had been proud of that name. She'd said the family was named for Jefferson Davis. That honky had been a tough dude, but it was a loser's name, no power in it. He'd had a lot of street names since. His mother hadn't liked those. When she threw him out, he took his own. Alim Nassau meant wise conqueror in both Arabic and Swahili. Not many knew what it meant, and so what? The name had power. Alim Nassau had a hell of a lot more power than George Washington Carver did. You could read about Alim Nassau in the newspapers, and he could still walk into City Hall and get in to see people. He'd been able to do that ever since he broke up a riot with his switchblade and the razor blades in his shoes and the chain he carried around his waist. There was all that federal money around for a tough dude. The honkies shoveled out money. Anything for quiet in the black ghetto. It had been a damn good game, and too bad it was over. He cursed quietly. Mayor Bentley Allen. Los Angeles had itself another black mayor, and this goddamn Tom had cut off the pipeline. New people in city council. And that stupid son of a bitch of a black congressman who couldn't be satisfied with the take. No, that asshole had to put all his relatives on the community payroll, and the fucking TV reporters found out. A black man in politics needed a Snow White rep these days. Well, the game was over, and he'd started another. 11 jobs, each one worked fine. They'd taken, what, $250,000 in loot in 4 years? Less than 100,000 after the fences went through it. 20,000 each for 4 men in 4 years. That wasn't even wages. Easy to say now that some of it should have been stashed for lawyers' fees, but at 5,000 a year? This would be the 13th. It wouldn't be long now. The store did a lot of business. Eileen waited, always aware of the time. 2 customers left, and nobody was coming down the street. He wasn't happy about this job. He didn't like ripping off blood. Honkies were fair game, but you ought to leave brothers alone. He'd hammered that into his followers' heads, and what were they thinking of him now? But he was boxed in. He had to act fast. The place was ripe, and he'd been saving it for an emergency, and this was one shit-pot motherfucker of an emergency. His honky lawyer would probably beat this for him, but lawyers and bondsmen wanted bread, and now. It was crazy, robbing a store to pay a lawyer to get him off for robbing a store. Someday things would be different. Alan Nassau would make them different. Almost time. 2 minutes ago, one of his brothers had got himself stopped for a traffic violation 14 blocks away, and that took one pigmobile off patrol. 20 minutes ago, another brother had a family argument, and the sister called the station house, and there went another fuzz wagon. There'd be only the 2. Black areas didn't get patrolled the way honky business districts did. Blacks didn't have big insurance policies or know how to kiss ass down at City Hall. Sometimes he used as many as 4 diversions, with traffic jams thrown in. They only took spreading some bread among the kids to get them playing in the streets. Nassau was a natural leader. He hadn't been busted since juvenile days, except for that last one, where an off-duty cop had come out of a laundromat. Who'd have thought that brother was a pig? He still wondered if he should have shot it out. Anyway, he hadn't. He'd run into an alley and ditched the gun and the mask in the bag. Lawyers could take care of those. The only other evidence was the honky storekeeper's identification, and there were ways to talk him out of testifying. Time. Eileen got out of the car. The mask looked like a face. From 10 feet away, you wouldn't know it was a mask at all. The gun was under his windbreaker. Windbreaker and mask would be gone 5 minutes after the job. Alan's mind closed down, shutting out past and future. He walked across at an intersection. No jaywalking, nothing to attract attention. The store was empty. It went down nice, no problems. He had the money and was on the way out when the brother came in. A man Alan had known for years. What was that bastard doing over in this part of town? Nobody from Boyle Heights ought to be down here below Watts. Ah, shit. But that brother knew. Maybe from his walk, maybe anything. Shit, he knew. It took him a second to make up his mind. Then Alim turned, aimed, and fired. A second shot, to be certain. The man went down, and the old storekeeper's eyes were big with horror, and Alim fired 3 times more. One more robbery wouldn't have upset anyone, but the pigs worked hard on murder. Best leave no witnesses. Too bad, though. He came out fast and didn't go to the stolen car across the street. Instead, he walked a fast half-block, went through an alleyway, and came out on another street. His arm still tingled with that unique atavistic thrill. Man was made to use a club, and a gun is the ultimate in clubs. Point and make a fist, and if the enemy is close enough to see his face, one blow will knock him over dead. Power. Elim knew people who had got hooked on that sensation. His brother, mother's son, not just blood, waited for him in a car that wasn't hot. They drove off just at the speed limit, fast enough not to attract attention, slow enough not to get busted. Had to waste too, Elim said. Harold winced, but his voice was cool. Too bad. Who were they? Nobody. Nobody important. Alright, well that's going to wrap it up today. Next, we'll continue on with subsection March 2. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you all enjoyed. Everybody stay safe out there.